In neither case had he done anything truly wrong. What appeared on screen did exist, kind of, just not in the way that it had been presented. These two near misses would prove crucial, perhaps the gateway drug when Martin Bashir came along soon after, asking for documents which didn't exist at all. Matt Weissler was very much primmer than Bashir had supposed. When it came to creating forgeries, not just harmless computerized mock-ups, but 100% dishonest forgeries, Bashir imagined Matt would join him in, what, a bit of shitbagging? But Matt's disgust reared up the moment he understood what had actually transpired, and thus he became a whistleblower. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. We're going to keep going in Dianarama today, and we have two chapters today. The first chapter is entitled Tapped and Bugged and Hacked, and then the second chapter is entitled The Crook, the Earl, and the Whistleblower, which, let me just tell you, the revelations in these chapters are stunning because they're so odd. Stories I've never heard before and connections I've never made. So especially the very last part of the second chapter we're going to read today is a story that is just, it really just defies logic. These connections, these sort of happenstance run-ins with the main players of the story, where if you were to write this in a novel, your editor would tell you that this was just too weird a coincidence to occur. And they would tell you to take it out because they would say, no one's going to believe that. That's kind of like, it seems so constructed. Who's orchestrating this, you know? So I think today's chapters, well, the other two I found incredibly interesting. I think these two are more revelatory than the other two, which was full of information that you probably did already know. And I think that the information in these next two chapters is the beginning of some stories, some tidbits, and some coincidences that you may not have been aware of. So I hope you enjoyed today's reading. Okay, so Chapter 3, Tapped and Bugged and Hacked. On January 17th, 1993, the Sunday newspaper, The People, ran the simple headline, Charles and Camilla, the tape. Inside was a transcript of a tape they had possessed for months, the record of a playful late-night phone conversation between Camilla and Charles, in which the prince joked about a life so dreadful that he likened his ill fortune to a flush-resistant tampon. The analogy was grimly poetic, the whole effect desperately tawdry. Never had a senior member of the royal family suffered such scarifying humiliation, the worse because it came not from the pen of a cruel satirist, but from the subject himself. Desperately embarrassing, then. Decades later, this conversation between our king and queen is so deeply embedded in the national psyche that it kindles mainly amused affection. Tina Brown, a close observer of the royal pageant, describes it well. The script, delivered in the prince's familiar mannered tones and Camilla's breathless basso, plays like a two-hander for Jeremy Irons and Emma Thompson at the National Theatre, so illuminating it is of adultery as performed at the top end of the class spectrum. But in 1993, the nation's reaction was astonishment, perhaps disgust, certainly a profound sense of having been lied to. The problem was not merely Charles' cack-handed drollery concerning tampons, but this clear demonstration that he and Camilla were a cavorting couple when any suggestion to that effect had always been dismissed. But how did it surface? Analysis of the tape reveals that the Camilla-gate conversation actually took place 13 days before Diana's Squidgy-gate chat with James Gilby. It had taken even longer to come to light. On December 18th, 1989, Prince Charles had been a guest of the Dowager Duchess of Westminster at Eaton Hall in Cheshire, with Camilla 200 miles away at her home, Middlewick House in Wiltshire. Once again, there is an impenetrable lack of clarity about the journey of the audio from speech to publication. The narrative offered by People newspaper editor Richard Stott is that an amateur radio geek trolling through the airwaves close to where Charles was based simply stumbled upon the call by accident. Stott recalled, the tape was made by a scouser who had a few pints of lager and a curry and decided he'd test out his latest gadget, an electronic homing device that picks up cellnet signals. As the time was round 2 a.m., there wasn't too much about, so he homed straight into Charles and Camilla. The story goes that the owner of the tape recognized Charles' voice and decided to record what followed. He then sat on his discovery for more than 2 years, until in the riot of publicity following Squidgygate he realized there could be money to be made, and a £30,000 deal with the newspapers followed. There's a counter-narrative. Former Conservative MP Giles Brandreth, an author with close connections to King Charles, reports how he and other members of Parliament tried to investigate the security breach at the time. Despite assurances from Prime Minister John Major that no government agencies had been involved, Brandreth reports that the skeptics were not convinced, believing instead the only people with equipment of sufficient sophistication to make the recordings were members of an intelligence service, either our own or that of another country. Voicing the most popular theory from this quarter, he said the Camillagate tape that was published was unofficially leaked by a mischief maker at GCHQ, anxious to expose the private behavior of the heir to the throne. Murky waters, indeed. As Patrick Jeffson told me, when something strange happens, like a tape appearing out of nowhere, of course speculation's pretty much impossible to control. And given the kind of theatrical nature of the royal family, we are royal people, we don't do ordinary things. It wouldn't just be a radio ham having a bit of fun. It has to be something more. Some rogue actor from the intelligence services. Yeah, that's an attractive theory. Everybody loves spy stories. Why not? It's hard to imagine that all of these leaked tapes weren't done by some kind of intelligence agency. I mean, the idea that just some guy had a couple of pints, ate a little bit of exotic food, and then he just got it into his pretty dumb head that maybe he just used his latest device to find some interesting audio, and who should he stumble upon but King Charles talking to Camilla about tampons? I mean, the likelihood of that. That's the problem. And the other thing that was discussed in the last chapter, this idea that they would record the call and then just sort of throw it into the universe. Cross your fingers, somebody finds it and reports it. That's so much luck involved. What are the actual chances that your little game would pan out? What are the chances that someone would stumble on this audio that you decided to rebroadcast? I mean, how many people are up at 2 o'clock in the morning just scanning the airwaves for some little tidbit? I think the other thing that's interesting is, why was it only ever these 2 phone calls? Like, if it was an actual practice that you had these geeks eating their curries and throwing back the lager and listening to interesting conversations at night, if that was like an actual thing that people did, wouldn't there be all manner of phone calls? I mean, all these people are cheating on each other. All these people have affair partners. Where are all the phone calls from all the other royals having all their affairs? It seems like it's a very specific set that they wanted to take down. I'm with those who believe that the intelligence agencies, or at least a rogue character within the intelligence agencies, was afoot. Either way, for Diana, here was a swooping curveball. Just when she'd begun to face up to the challenge of dealing with the tappers and the hackers, it now appeared that some of the spooks might actually be on her side. Was there a faction at GCHQ cheering for the princess, as keen to embarrass Charles as their colleague had been to humiliate her? The story unfolded under a cloud of unknowing. Were the spooks good or bad? Were they following Diana's activities at all? And if not, with someone so potentially vulnerable, why not? The Daily Mail's Richard Kay, the best-informed Diana whisperer of that period, said to me, Diana had this enormous capacity to cause trouble, wittingly or unwittingly, for the royal family, and I think there was a view that if they had an idea of what she was up to, they could head it off or deal with it before it became a major issue. Certainly Diana's cooperation with author Andrew Morton would cause the royal family plenty of trouble, as Diana herself seemed to recognize. Morton told me she was worried about being overheard on the telephone, so we had to buy these scrambler telephones, which were utterly useless, quite frankly. Cost us $3,000. And we paid for her rooms at Kensington Palace to be looked at for bugs and other devices. She was always looking for that kind of suspicious behavior. As we got closer to that fateful day, when Diana and Martin Bashir first met in 1995, there are clear signs that Diana was not only convinced that she was the subject of malign surveillance, but increasingly determined to evade it. The evidence I've chosen to look at seemed to me the most credible kind, Diana's own words. And in this case, her words reported in a document which was never expected to become public. On October 18, 1994, Met Police Deputy Assistant Commissioner David Meynell, head of Royalty and Diplomatic Protection Department, compiled a 3-page memorandum marked secret, with, at the bottom of the first page, the handwritten note, Home Secretary briefed. What Meynell was recording was a meeting earlier that day with Diana, referred to simply as HRH. HRH did not display any of the confrontational attitude which was evident during our last meeting. She was friendly and bright on the surface. Her optimistic opening quickly turns much darker as the document goes on and says, during the course of the conversation, HRH bluntly asked me if her car had been bugged. She then said to me, Even when no one knows where I'm going in my car, there are people waiting for me at the other end. She then told me that she knew her telephones were being tapped and that she was certain the same applied to her vehicle. She stated that she had proof that her phones were being tapped because she had set traps on 4 occasions and she'd got the necessary evidence. She stated that while she had a lot of enemies, she had a lot of friends, some in places of knowledge. She could not name them because they would lose their jobs, but she had been told that without any doubt 5 people from an organization had been assigned full-time to oversee her activities, including listening to her private phone conversations. She stated that while she was certain of her ground, she could not assist further without jeopardizing the identities of her friends, and this she was not prepared to do. In navigating a life where disturbing events happened almost daily, Diana had done her damnedest to seek out a rational explanation. She'd gone to the very top, the head of Royal Security, and said, "Are you watching me, following me?" And they'd said, "Of course not." In the early 1990s, at the height of the terror campaign then being waged by the IRA in London, it seems much easier to believe that Diana was being secretly surveilled than that she was not. It seems likely that at the very least the authorities would have been desperate to keep eyes on young William, next king but one, and therefore felt it their duty to keep tabs on his mum. As Richard Kay put it, I think it would be naive, frankly, to assume that there wasn't some sort of eyes being kept on Diana to see what she was up to. I wouldn't be at all surprised if people were being asked to keep an eye on who she saw and where she went. Meynell's memo would remain secret for 13 years until the inquest into Diana's death opened in October 2007. Those proceedings offer a priceless glimpse into Diana's solo tussle with the authorities. A witness called to give evidence on January 7, 2008, was Graham Harding, a former military policeman who had started a company providing electronic security services, including checking for phone taps and sweeping for bugs. 4 times in 1994, Diana asked Harding to conduct a sweep of her apartment, and 3 times he drew a blank, but then, as Harding said, "My equipment detected an electronic signal which indicated that a possible bugging device may have been present behind a wall in her bedroom. Princess Diana was present when I found this signal. I did not know what was on the other side of the wall and was not able to investigate further as I did not have access. When we returned the following day," Harding said, "it was gone. There was nothing. I went to exactly the same place, with exactly the same equipment, with exactly the same thing, and there was no evidence at all of any transmission." A false reading, a technical glitch. Diana felt she needed to do something, and so Graham Harding became a key player in Diana's homegrown security setup. He would describe to the inquest how, to protect her privacy, he would take out mobile phone contracts with Vodafone in his name, yet give the Nokia handset to Diana to use, changing the number every 3 or 4 weeks. When the phone bill arrived at his address, he would pay it, and Diana settling up later. Even with these precautions, Diana felt unsafe. I've spoken with her brother, Charles Spencer, many times on these issues, and he believes his sister was an early victim of the technique which became notorious more than a decade later. He said reading things in the paper that she'd only said to really close friends made her extremely unsettled. It's my theory that, before anyone even knew the term, she was probably being phone hacked. It looks like paranoia, but I think she was finding very, very private things that she'd only said to close friends or confidants were getting in the papers. I've talked to various members of my family, and we believe she was phone hacked, even though she didn't know such a phenomenon existed. Diana's dread would be proven in stark terms in August 1995, not long before her first fateful encounter with Martin Bashir. One of Diana's senior confidants at this time was Sir Max Hastings, one of the country's most distinguished journalists, someone whom Diana knew it was safe to use as a sounding board. He told me, "I was rung up by our neighbor in the country, Peter Palumbo, and he said, 'Diana wants to see you.' So I went, and I spent a couple of hours with Diana, and she asked me what I knew about a conspiracy, allegedly funded by a mining tycoon called Peter Monk, to get David Wine Morgan, the public relations man, to arrange to have her put down. Peter Monk, who died in 2018, was at the same time the 60-year-old billionaire boss of the world's biggest gold mining company, and counted Prince Charles among his friends. David Wine Morgan was a 64-year-old former journalist with a roster of blue-chip clients. No shred of evidence exists for either man's involvement in a plot to murder Diana." Max Hastings recalled, "I said, 'Well, I know absolutely nothing about this. I knew both Peter Monk and David Morgan, and it sounded absolutely crazy to me. But she did believe this sort of stuff. I don't know who was feeding her this sort of thing, but I do think she was ready to believe it.'" Diana's fears were often clearly off target. In 1993, 6 months after fire had torn through Windsor Castle, destroying 115 rooms, causing damage of more than £30 million, she announced an astonishing find to Patrick Jeffson. He told me, "She took me upstairs to the nursery floor, finger to her lips, pulled back the carpet, and there were these little holes bored in the floorboard. 'Look,' she said, 'these are for bugs for microphones.' And I said, 'No, they're not. Ever since the Windsor fire, we've been putting in new motion detector, things like that.' That wasn't the answer that she wanted." By the summer of 1995, Princess Diana was in a strange place. But then, she was always in a strange place. How could it be otherwise for the most famous, certainly the most scrutinized person in the world? Many people find the business of dragging themselves out of bed, doing a job, handling the routine fallout of a failed marriage, the kids one weekend but not the next, more than enough to cope with. Diana's job meant touring an AIDS ward, or the Taj Mahal, touring Croydon or Japan. But it was still a job, and one which had to be done every day in front of a million cameras, waiting for her to be slightly fatter or thinner or wear the same dress twice over. So Diana had all that, and strong evidence, too, that she was being bugged and tapped and hacked. So, in her place, do you shrug and hope for the best? Or decide it's safer to fear the worst? Oh, the setup is ripe for her to meet Martin Bashir, but who was this strange man who decided to lumber into her life, convince her that she was right, that she should be paranoid, and then set off to ruin her life? Well, this next chapter is entitled The Crook, the Earl, and the Whistleblower, and those people are obviously the crook being Martin Bashir, the Earl is her brother, Charles Spencer, and then the whistleblower is somebody who worked with Martin Bashir, who helped to make documents for Panorama, and he was like a set designer and a graphic designer. And the whistleblower is the one who's going to ultimately help Martin Bashir fool Diana. But he wasn't exactly clear that what he was doing was wrong. And once he realized that something he had done had caused her demise, he was so broken up about it that he went to authorities. So this chapter is setting up all those characters in this drama. Customers lunching at the trendy Clapham Music and Wine Bar Numero Uno one Sunday in the spring of 2000 will have nudged one another, whispered, and pointed. Tapping a set of bongo drums, really quite well, was a 37-year-old leather-jacketed figure everyone recognized. At that point in history, probably the most famous television reporter in the world. Martin Bashir had come up to join the house band Surf and Turf as they launched into the old Dionne Warwick hit Walk On By. Their bassist, Jonathan Maitland, was, like the rest of the lineup, a media guy who just liked to play a bit for fun, free drinks and taxi money. Bashir was a hit, according to Maitland. He was excellent. He's serious about music. And he was serious. In due course, when more famous still, Bashir would write songs with strange-sounding titles like Of Every Little Boy and Ya Help I From Bout Ya, singing harmony and playing bass on a reggae album that he recorded in New York called Bass Lion. Promoting the album, he told an interviewer, "I grew up on a very large housing project in London. There were a large number of Jamaican families who came on HMS Windrush in the 1950s. They all lived on this housing project. And that was the first time I heard reggae, and from there I grew to love it." Did he sing from Princess Diana in the autumn of 1995? If it would have assisted, he surely would have. People who know him well say that when he set out to charm, he was inventive and irresistible. Maitland, a close colleague and sort of friend for 6 years, offered, with Diana, he would have found out whatever it was that made her tick. She would have been pretty gullible and vulnerable at the moment of maximum stress. Before the famous Panorama broadcast, Bashir was more or less a nobody, but a striver. Born on a Wandsworth Council estate, one of 5 children of parents who were immigrants from Pakistan, he went to the local comprehensive before studying English at King Alfred's College, Winchester. He did very well to win a researcher job at the BBC, aged 23 in 1986, going front of camera for the first time on the BBC Two current affairs program, Public Eye. A worthy but low-wattage strand looking at UK domestic issues with a furrowed brow. Bashir's episodes had titles like The Doctor's Dilemma, Cash or Care, and Youth Crime, Targeting the Tearaways. It was solid BBC fare, though the first indication that Bashir might not always play by the rules came during his time on the show. In 1991, he persuaded Michelle Hathaway, the mother of 9-year-old Karen Hathaway, murdered 5 years previously, to help an investigation he was undertaking for the program. Bashir pleaded that if he could only take away the clothes Karen had worn on the night she was murdered, by then returned to the family by police, he would have them DNA tested. Perhaps it would lead them to Karen's killer? I'm told by someone who witnessed this encounter that Bashir gave the appearance of being horror-stricken by Karen's death. Then he sobbed openly. He won permission to take away Karen's vest, knickers, t-shirt, and sweatshirt, but there was no DNA testing. The investigation was dropped and there was no program, which might happen for any number of reasons. But it was Bashir's failure to return the items to Karen's poor mum, indeed to acknowledge that he had taken them at all, which hurt and seems to indicate heartlessness. Mrs. Hadaway raised it with the BBC, tentatively at first, forcefully later, and as recently as 2023 finally received an apology and compensation. How do you pay a mother for her children's last article of clothing? What compensation? Like, what's the dollar amount on that? You know, I mean, it took them until 2023 to apologize to this woman because one of their reporters, in a fit of fake emotion, wept in front of her to get these items of clothing so he could have them DNA tested, and then never did the program, and then never returned the clothes. And then years later, in 2023, they're like, oh, here's some cash. Sorry. Bashir, even that early in his career, would have found Mrs. Hadaway a pushover. As he demonstrated later, he found wiles enough to bewitch even the most skittish, the most media-wary subjects, to have them trust him before destroying themselves. It's a remarkable record to have interviewed arguably the two most famous people in the world, Princess Diana and Michael Jackson, to have beaten off 1,000 other reporters to get the scoop, and in both cases, to be accused of hastening their demise. But the charm was not something which oozed naturally, like the 100-watt charisma of a Hollywood star. In my brief dealing with Bashir at the BBC, he didn't seem to sparkle at all. When he engaged the chosen gear, that's when the magic happened. In Maitland's experience, he was fantastic at looking in your eyes and telling you, you're brilliant. It's like a snake charmer, you know? You're in the intense glare of his spotlight and you don't know any better. He was brilliant at doing sincerity. Without having yet done much that was brilliant as a journalist, Bashir was promoted from Public Eye to Panorama in 1992. But this was an era when the BBC's formerly magisterial public affairs strand was in trouble. The grand dame of BBC journalism, born in 1953, almost as old as the Archers, was at that time the victim of scatterbrained policies originating with Director General John Birt, and roundly shunned by viewers. The new regime had fired many of the experienced reporters and were forced to fill the void with recruits, like Bashir, only too happy to whistle a new tune even though it meant whistling largely in the dark. When Bashir joined Panorama, one of the few remaining old-school reporters was Tom Mangold, then approaching 60 years of age, with 30 years BBC experience behind him and a swashbuckling Fleet Street career before that. Mangold told me Bashir was brought on to the program by the deputy editor who worked with him on Public Eye. He was ambitious and had sharp elbows. After decades of reporting villainy of all kinds, with 120 Panorama films under his belt, Mangold prides himself on sniffing out a charlatan better than most. And so he still gives Bashir amused respect today. We were all drinking at Albertine's at the bottom of Wood Lane. And one day Martin came up to me, took me to one side and said, "Mr. Mangold, I'm sorry to trouble you, but I just wanted to tell you that my brother recently died, and on his deathbed he said to me, 'Martin, when you get to Panorama, imitate Tom Mangold. Write like Tom Mangold. Operate like him, and you'll become as successful as he is.'" And I was really touched. I thought, how nice. Nobody flatters anybody in this business. What I didn't know until later was that he told exactly the same story to Mike Nicholson at ITV, to John Humphreys. So this was Martin's introduction to famous reporters, to make sure that they were on his side. It's a neat technique. I kind of admire him for it. You guys, are we hearing this? How desperate would one have to be flattered to buy the line, Mr. Mangold, I'm sorry to bother you. Can I just take you aside for a second? I just wanted to tell you that on my brother's dying deathbed, he told me that if I would just imitate you, write like you, be like you, I could one day be a success, and I just wanted to share that little tidbit with you. And you wouldn't realize that you were being manhandled by a manipulative snake? It's just so obvious. I don't know if it's because as women, we are so often given lines and, foolish flattery by men who have one objective in mind so that we can sense it instantly when we're being falsely flattered. But that would not work on me. Anyway, Bashir had indeed experienced family heartbreak. His father suffered recurrent bouts of mental suffering, which made him frequently suicidal. His 29-year-old brother Tommy died in 1991 after a lifelong struggle with muscular dystrophy. Tommy's death came up during Bashir's appearance on ITV's Celebrity X Factor in 2019. Bashir recalled then how his brother's fortitude remained an inspiration, telling the audience and judges, with a catch in his throat, "Every time I've faced a challenge, I heard him whispering, saying, 'What excuse do you have?' That's my motivation." Jonathan Maitland, working closely alongside Bashir on the ITV program Tonight, shortly after he achieved worldwide fame with the Diana interview, remembers a steelier kind of motivation. He used techniques back then that were considered acceptable. Aggressive, ruthless shitbagging. Bashir's techniques will be described later, but as a guide to how well they might work on someone particularly susceptible, we have Diana's own words. She sent him a note written as she sat surrounded by the newspapers, one story everywhere, the morning after the infamous Panorama interview went out in November 1995. "This is more than a polite thank you. This is from a co-conspirator, but one still chugging the Kool-Aid, unaware that they have been totally shitbagged." The note says, "Dearest Martin, apart from the fact that you're able to produce a mean pasta in my kitchen, you have other extraordinary qualities of which I have seen and worked with during the last months. Since you choose to be deaf to my verbal recognition and admiration, you leave me no choice but to revert to the pen. There are no words adequate to express how I now feel, having had my wings returned to me, and with that so many other doors opening. I never dreamt that such a response was possible, and I am immensely humbled by the reaction. You have made, no argument please, enormous sacrifices to release me, and have had to pay a high price for such dedication. Thank you, Martin, for listening to me, for supporting me, for understanding this particular lady. No one has ever shown such belief and acted upon it. Lots of love, from Diana." Only 3 months before that note was written, Martin Bashir had made his first tentative approach to Diana's family. On August 24, 1995, he telephoned the Spencer family home in Northamptonshire, asking for her brother Charles. He wasn't there, but his secretary, Carol Sprigg, took a note. "Not seeking interview or info, 15 minutes of time to talk, no filming or interview, just talk." Bashir followed up with a letter addressed to her that same day. "Thanks for your helpfulness during our telephone conversation earlier today. It was much appreciated. As I said, it's not my intention to record or publish any discussion with Earl Spencer, but simply to share some information which I believe may be of interest." The letter on Panorama's branded note paper seemed like something one could trust. Bashir offered to back it up with a note from management, what he called a letter of comfort, guaranteeing confidentiality. "I do hope that this will allay any natural anxieties that may arise." Charles Spencer did not reply. Ironically, although a journalist himself, he hated journalists. Ever since Diana had been named as Prince Charles' fiancée more than 15 years earlier, he had been a target for the tabloids, simply by being Di's younger brother. But there was meat there, too. Besides being the brother of the world's most famous woman, uncle of King-to-be, some events in Spencer's own life seemed almost too rambunctious for the most rollicking Jilly Cooper novel. Spencer's best man at his wedding in 1989 was the handsomely exotic half-Iranian ex-Bullingdon Club rosterer, Darius Guppy, a friend since Eton and Oxford, and a gold smuggler. By the way, if you don't know what Bullingdon Club is for my American audience, Bullingdon Club is a group of highly elite individuals who act in wild ways, trash places, and receive nary a slap on the wrist for their behavior. And incidentally, a member of this Bullingdon Club was Candace Owens' husband, George Farmer. Anyway, back to our story. Guppy was happily and illegally shipping large amounts of bullion to India, but then devised a much bigger scheme to defraud the Lloyd's insurance giant of $1.8 million by staging a jewel robbery, hiring a stooge to fire a handgun to heighten the stakes. When the scheme unraveled in 1993, Guppy was sentenced to 5 years in jail. But the fallout seemed to threaten Spencer too. The Daily Express published a piece claiming that Spencer had helped launder the proceeds of the insurance scam. Precisely at the time when Bashir made his approach, Spencer was deep in discussions with his lawyers about taking Express to court. He did, winning damages for a story that would prove to be grossly untrue. Spencer also had another beef with the media just then. In 1991, he had struck up an acquaintance with Alan Waller, an ex-pair he met on a news assignment to the war-torn Balkans. From that meeting came the offer of a job. Would Waller like to be a security chief at Althorp, cottage provided? He would, though by the end of 1993 the relationship had broken down. Spencer suspected Waller of selling gossip to the tabloids, and in March 1994 had secured an injunction preventing him disclosing, publishing, or revealing to any party whomsoever information concerning the private lives, personal affairs, or private conduct of the Earl, his wife, children, or members of the royal family. Crucially, it was this feud between Spencer and Waller which Bashir would pick up on before making his move. So who was Charles Spencer, the then 31-year-old Mediaverse journalist being targeted by the 32-year-old Panorama reporter? The Spencers are one of those very few families in England who, thanks to their own extraordinarily long lineage, are able to glance over so slightly askance at the royals. It was John Spencer who first moved into Althorp in 1486, when the Tudors were still very new. And so Spencer descendants might consider the tumble of monarchs calling themselves Stuart, then Hanover, then Saxe-Coburg, then Windsor, and, though I guess they never do, whisper, new money. The Spencer money derived from canny investment in vast flocks of sheep, reared on pastures through Northamptonshire, Warwickshire, and Leicestershire. So much wool and so lucrative that in 1756 the first Earl Spencer was able to build what remains one of the grandest houses in London, Spencer House in St. James, leased now to the Rothschild family, but valued at something around £50 million. A writer, still by profession, Spencer had been remarkably open in describing a family history which, shorn of the gilding of great wealth and fame, sounds remarkably human. Too often sad. As a small boy, he sensed the tension between the two men he adored most, his father and grandfather. He would write, "It was sad, particularly in the years following my parents' divorce, that these two lonely men, who both had so much to give, could not break through the distance they had established between one another, to enjoy each other as men, even if not as father and son." So grand were the Spencer connections that the Queen stood as Charles's godmother for his christening in Westminster Abbey. The first 11 years of his boyhood were spent at Park House on the Sandringham estate. But for a boy still too little to know that he had been dealt a magnificent hand, the cards must have seemed desperately cruel. Spencer was just 3 when his parents' marriage collapsed. He had described in detail how at 8 years old he was packed off to a boarding school, where he suffered not just intense loneliness, but beatings and sexual abuse. Even when apart, his parents carried on fighting, in an acrimonious court battle for custody of Charles and Diana. The court sided with Spencer's father, who then poisoned the emotional brew still further by marrying the seeming stepmother from hell, Rain, dubbed Acid Rain by the children, whom Spencer castigates for selling off family heirlooms and revamping stately Althorp in shades of pink and electric green, that he describes as the wedding cake vulgarity of a 5-star hotel in Monaco. It was only when his father died in March 1992 that Spencer was able to assume control, turf Rain out, and, as 9th Earl Spencer, make his own rules. By then he was already a well-known face, certainly for viewers of the American television network NBC. In 1986, 22-year-old Spencer had taken on a correspondence role for the company. The skills that would make him a successful writer were evident even then, and he was a good reporter, though his bosses were not blind to the glamour of the English milord, probably more famous than anyone he would be called upon to interview. Because, of course, all that had gone on in the Spencer family since 1981 had played out in the harsh reflected gleam of Diana's fame. Tabloids, which would have discounted upper-class shenanigans elsewhere, were avid for any gossip concerning Di's dad, Di's stepmom, and Di's brother. In 1995, his relationship with the gold smuggler Darius Guppy had brought some media attention. Yet more intrusive still were the reporters trying to get inside the Spencer marriage, then 6 years old and clearly in trouble, almost a proxy for the collapsing union of Diana and that other Charles. So furious had Spencer become that by that summer he was planning to uproot his family, wife Victoria and already 4 children, Kitty aged 4, twins Eliza and Amelia aged 2, and the 1-year-old Spencer heir Louis. Their bolt hole was to be in South Africa, a mansion just inside the gated Silverhurst estate in the Constantia wine country, just south of Cape Town. It was while these plans were being finalized that Bashir first cornered Spencer. And, in something of a coincidence, Bashir's plan would depend entirely on a clever piece of work carried out by a young man from the Constantia Valley. Matt Weissler is the 3rd character it is vital to know in understanding what happened to Princess Diana. How Matt sees his role in the scandal is complicated, even to this day. But certainly there is a large measure of guilt, plus a willingness to own up, which I have found entirely absent when it comes to most BBC characters who had a hand in events. On September 6, 1997, the day of Diana's funeral, Matt didn't know anything like the full story of what had gone on, but he did have a sense that something very bad had happened, and that he had been partly responsible. Alone among the million people who gathered along the funeral route that bright morning to watch the flag-draped coffin trundle by, young William and Harry following after, Matt had a horrible sense that he was somehow to blame for Diana's death. He'd arrived at Kensington Palace before dawn. He told me, "I was standing right by the gate at 4 a.m. because I felt very strongly that I did have a hand in it. This little thing that I did, which I knew was a bad judgment the day after, just turned into this effing national drama. And you're standing there, and there's a funeral cortege, and little boys standing there, you know. Please don't cry, boys. You're with your dad," and stiff upper lip, and yeah. Matt Weissler was born in June 1962 to a German couple who had settled in South Africa's Western Cape. Life was still sweet for a prosperous middle-class family, even in the turbulent last years of apartheid. Following school, then 4 years at the prestigious Michaelis School of Fine Art, Matt thought about architecture, maybe sculpture as a career. But then, in December 1985, he boarded a plane bound for London. There was a buzz about graphic design, with artists on the cusp of switching from pens, card, and glue to what seemed like the infinite possibilities offered by new computers. In television, the excitement was maybe greatest of all, and in 1986, coincidentally the same year that both Bashir and Spencer also entered TV, he was hired by the BBC as a graphic designer. His first big assignment was a project lasting 4 whole years, helping devise the graphics for the 1992 general election on BBC One. He told me, "We had to plan different scenarios for all the individual constituencies, 14,000 different permutations, and on the night the producers could line it all up to tell the story live, digitally. Never been done before, anywhere." One of his innovations was the famous swingometer, wielded by presenter Peter Snow. His work was lavishly praised, winning the Royal Television Society Award that year. Next, the plum posting for an ambitious designer was Panorama. The producers on that show always needed something arresting and stylish, and more often than not, they needed it now. It meant late nights, working up to the wire, on a program often still being edited minutes before transmission. Pressures like that built strong bonds, a trench camaraderie, which could begin to feel like friendship. Weissler remembers working on at least 5 different Panorama films with Bashir, assisting with the text-based visuals, but also planning and shooting sequences of drama reconstruction. He told me, "I really wanted to be a director, so I started directing stuff, and that was huge, you know. It led me to having a very close relationship with Martin." The possibilities offered by computers to create something which didn't exist in reality, but which looked very much as if it might, was tempting for producers and reporters on Panorama especially. Often dry-sounding but crucial passages of narrative needed bringing to life, though it wasn't quite clear where the line should be drawn. Was what the viewer saw on TV real, or was it not? Twice, Matt Weissler found himself uncomfortably straddling that line. In a film looking at the finances of former England football manager Terry Venables, an authentic-seeming document appeared on screen. Figures in it were accurate, verifiable, but the computerized version was a construct. Another film in July 1994 made serious allegations about London police officers, once again showing what appeared to be incriminating documents. Accurate, but computerized. On this occasion, Weissler was credited as having provided special effects, which led to a nervy confrontation when detectives showed up a short time later at Panorama offices. Matt recalled, "In there sat 2 men who were just terrifyingly clever, who interviewed me for quite some time as to how I went about making these documents. In neither case had he done anything truly wrong. What appeared on screen did exist, kind of, just not in the way that it had been presented. These 2 near misses would prove crucial, perhaps the gateway drug when Martin Bashir came along soon after, asking for documents which didn't exist at all." Scraps like these were a part of the bonding which happened at Panorama, unlikely bonds, formed in adversity. Bashir wasn't a friendly figure, Tom Mangold told me. Nobody really knew him. He didn't seem to have many friends on the program. But Bashir and Matt Weissler began taking their lunches together, playing squash. Bashir collaborated his banter for what he imagined would put him nicely on a level with Matt, one of the program's players, he being a reporter and a gentleman. Though one day he got it badly wrong. Matt was seeing a Panorama secretary, Lucy Noble, to whom he has now been married for 30 years. He recalled to me, I started dating Lucy, and he sort of saw it unfolding from his little cubicle. And one morning I was in for a meeting, and he says, "Had a nice time with Lucy, did you, last night? Effed her up the arse?" And I was like, and then he walks away. He wasn't looking for my reaction. If only Martin Bashir had lingered to see Matt's reaction, it might have saved him endless grief later on. Because that bit of tackiness illuminates everything that came after. Matt Weissler was very much primmer than Bashir had supposed. When it came to creating forgeries, not just harmless computerized mock-ups, but 100% dishonest forgeries, Bashir imagined Matt would join him in, what, a bit of shitbagging? But Matt's disgust reared up the moment he understood what had actually transpired, and thus he became a whistleblower. There's a coda to this chapter, a story which has always seemed to me so extraordinary that it would be wrong not to share. In a narrative filled with bizarre events, this ranks among the strangest of all. In August 1998, 3 years after the Panorama interview, and exactly a year after Diana's death, Martin Bashir was by then still basking in universal fame. The BBC had, by that point, cast out whistleblower Matt Weissler, blacklisted him. But he was nevertheless enjoying a pleasant Sunday afternoon on the river just downriver from Hampton Court. He hired a boat with his mother-in-law Penny, his new wife Lucy, and 1-year-old son Oscar, and joined the armada of pleasure seekers rowing happily on the sparkling water. Then something caught Matt's eye. I spotted a man in a full 3-piece suit standing by the edge of the water, and he walked right into the water, holding his hands out, sort of like Jesus. And we instantly thought, right, this is not good intent. By the time I rowed over to him, he disappeared under the surface. As my boat drifted past, I saw his face deep underwater. Matt's mother-in-law could see there was no time to waste. She shouted, "Get in there! Get this man out!" She pushed me. I fell in the water, swam around, grabbed him. I swam to the edge, pulled him out of the water, and he was sort of half lying on top of me. And then he started crying, and he got this wet wallet out, and in it was a photograph. And I was gobsmacked. I was looking at Martin Bashir's face. And he goes, "This is my son. He's very famous." And he said, "I haven't seen my son in many, many years, because I'm just a janitor at a hospital in Tooting." And something about being estranged from him. Within minutes, the police arrived. Matt says one of the officers took him aside. He said, "This guy's got a lot of previous attempts to say goodbye to this world." I got his address, which was Tooting, and so I sent him a postcard afterwards saying, "I'm very glad that I managed to save your life. I hope things go better for you." They did not. In 2021, Bashir spoke to the Sunday Times, the only interview he gave in response to the damaging verdict of the Dyson report. Bashir told the newspaper, "In 2001, I had to identify my father's body because he took his own life. His body was dragged from the river." You guys, is that not the craziest happenstance? The whistleblower pulls the crook's father out of the river 3 years after he's been blacklisted because of what the crook's done, but the crook is going on to fame and fortune? That's insanity. This story is like so made up. Like I said at the beginning, if that story at the very end had been in any kind of novel, any kind of like wild, royal, crazy, scandal, romance, some kind of fiction, as an editor, I would have said, really? Please. That's a little convenient, all the characters overlapping in such a wild way. But this is truth. This is a crazy book. I don't know about you guys, but I'm thoroughly enjoying this. It's very different than some of the other books we've read. Very different. It's not a biography in the sense that the author stands clear away from the project and doesn't give his opinion, because this is very much an opinion piece on the way this author sees that the facts unfolded. And well, I'm not saying he's making anything up. I'm just saying it's flush with his opinion of it. Like, I'm thinking back to the way he described Prince Charles's interview about Camilla, and the way he won't take certain stances on certain subjects, like he's not going to weigh in on whether Diana's bodyguard who was killed in the street, what was the nature of their relationship. He's not looking to weigh in there. But we do feel his opinions about certain people's performances. And he is giving lots of color in the way he writes, which I'm loving. I love the way this guy writes. It's very amusing. But that is the end of part 1. And next week, we're going to start with part 2. That part is entitled The Takedown. So how is this slimy character, Bashir, going to get into Diana's lane? And how is he going to cozy up to her? And how is he going to convince her that he's trustworthy? Quite frankly, of all the people that he'd ever narrowed in on, she was probably the easiest person he ever found to take down, because she was so vulnerable and so certain that forces were against her, that if you came with even the most paltry evidence, she already had compiled all of her own evidence and coincidences to assure her that there was an enemy. So, but Martin Bashir had his work literally cut out for him. All he had to do was come and piece the parts together. I'm very interested to read the rest of this with you guys. What did you think about the story where he convinced that woman to give up the clothes her daughter had died in, said he was going to get them DNA tested, didn't return the items, and then the BBC dragged their feet? I mean, like, what a microcosm of this much larger, bigger story. But is that the way they're running the show over there? Troublemakers. Keep your eyes out today for another video. I'm going to be posting about Meghan's new holiday special with Love Meghan. Obviously had their last hoopla, their last show on Netflix, and it's an hour long. Brace yourself for that, but it's going to be coming out later today, so keep your eyes open for that. And then, of course, tomorrow I'll see you for the Friday News Roundup. All right, thanks so much for hanging out. I'll see you soon. Bye.